What's happening, my fellow geeks and geekettes? Welcome to a brand new episode of Cosplay Chris, and in this video I'm going to be showing you the process of prepping, molding, casting, painting and finishing this half-scale Michael Jai White Spawn 1997 resin printed bust. For the longest time I have always wanted a display bust, whether it be full size, full scale, or half scale of Michael Jai White Spawn. I think it is such an underrated film, especially when it comes to the casting of Michael Jai White and also that beautiful makeup and costume design by K&B Effects. So I enlisted the help of my good friend Sean Dabbs, who is a wonderfully talented 3D artist who has helped me in the past with some Freddy busts, to design the 3D file for the Spawn bust. It was then printed on a Formlabs Form 3L printer. This thing is an absolute beast. It took 2 days to resin print. Keep in mind, this is just half scale. Imagine doing a full scale, but the detail was so spot on and so crisp because the settings were dialed in so well on the printer that we use. So I've done all the prep work, I've removed all the support material, I've gone in and sprayed a few coats of primer fill because there were a few print lines on the noggin, and I also did the playing card method. If you don't know what that is, it's essentially when you get some cheap playing cards, put them around the perimeter of the print or the piece you're molding to essentially create a flange for excess spillage of resin. I then sealed it up with some duct tape. I've just sealed in certain areas as well, like undercuts with some oil-based clay, and we're good to go. So the first step is we're going to be molding it in Pinky Seal silicone from Barnes Products. Now the idea is to do regular resin castings using Supercast. I'm also tinkering with the idea of using a green tinted Bee Queen resin, which is a translucent resin, so we possibly have the option of green glowing eyes. I've already got the paint down pat for how I want these to look on a smaller print that was done by my good friend Ben Ball of Venable FX. But before we get to any of that, we've got to cover this beast in a lot of silicone. So with that being said, let's get to it. You know it's time for some good old-fashioned shitty commentary. So of course, as per usual, using some Pinky Seal silicone, mix ratio is 100 to 100. Now, on the first coat, which is called a print coat, I really took it upon myself to really get in the details, especially the teeth. You really do risk getting air bubbles in the mouth there if there is exposed teeth, and the eyes as well. Now, all up, I did 9 coats, and I'm just obviously speeding through the actual process because it's pretty much a rinse and repeat process. Though a few coats, I did use what's called thick sil. So you add a drop to your batch of silicone and you can essentially put it on a vertical surface because there are some areas of 3D prints, especially raised areas, where you need a bit of extra care. So once that was all done, I'm drawing up my dividing wall for our plaster bandage mother mold. Now, usually I'd use fiberglass, but fiberglass scares me sometimes, and especially for a more scaled down piece like this, you can get away with using plaster bandage, and the Gypsona plaster bandage is so strong once it's fully cured and set and all dried out, and you can even use it on big stuff. So I'm just cleaning up the seam line there just to make sure there's no like wild little feral bits there. And in terms of a release, you can use Vaseline. In this case, I'm actually using Vicks Vapor Rub. That's all we had around at the time. And the vapors will not affect the curing of the plaster at all, but you need some sort of barrier so we can have a separation point with the actual plaster bandage shell. Again, for bigger scale stuff, I would probably use fiberglass, but in this case, for a scaled down version, you can definitely use plaster bandage. And I love using plaster bandage. It's so therapeutic for me, as well as the silicone process. You kind of just zen out, zone out, and really just get creative and kind of just make sure everything is nice and sturdy. Now, once that was set, I let it set overnight because it was pretty hot that day, but I just want to make sure it's completely dried out. So I'm going to separate the two pieces. Going to grab an X-Acto knife and start to cut our seam line very carefully, also making sure not to slice my bloody finger off. So I'm doing it in a smooth zigzag pattern so that way it's going to lock back in place. If you just cut a straight line, you are going to have mismatched places. Now, when I was peeling the actual silicone skin off, I was very careful and very slow, especially around the skull pieces and of course his face with his eyes and mouth. So once everything was put back together, I'm just going to use some old disposable pegs just to keep everything in place when we're mixing around our resin inside the actual mold. I'm going to be using good old-fashioned Supercast, much like Pinky Seal. Mix ratio is 100 to 100 with a shitload of black tint thrown in there. Now, usually when it comes to black tint, or just any tints in general for polyurethane and silicones and stuff like that, if you use too much, it can affect the consistency and the strength of the final product. Now, all up, I think I used 200 gram batches each time, and I did 4 slush coats. Obviously the first one being a print coat, much like the silicone. You got to make sure we get into all that detail. What I learned doing the second casting, this is obviously the first casting, but when I did a second one, I got a disposable brush, and on the first coat of silicone, I brushed it all inside the head, especially where the teeth are, because you definitely do run the risk of getting air bubbles in the teeth and also the eyes, and that can just ruin and throw off the entire casting, and sometimes you're gonna have to do patchwork or start again. Now, obviously, just going to demold here. You see our seam line there. Pretty happy with how that turned out. There is a bit of cleanup required, but most times out of 10, it brushes right off. And again, very slowly pulling it off the casting, especially when it comes to those teeth. If you pull too hard, some of the silicone can actually snap off and stay embedded in the mouth, and you are screwed because you have essentially ruined your mold and future castings at that point. And I was very happy with how this first casting turned out. I ended up doing 3 more, but the one purely in the video is this first casting you see right here. That detail is so clean and crisp. You can actually see a few pieces of silicone off to the side, which is fine. Now, in terms of the seam line, it was pretty easy. There were some parts that I had to attack with a Dremel, just on the buffing tool on my, I always call it a Dremel, it's a bloody Ryobi tool. So after we've cleaned all the flashing off from the overspill, he's looking pretty good. Now I'm going to be using a super cheap auto spray putty. Not only will that help with any imperfections, like kind of filling them in, but this is also going to be our base color for the teeth and the eyes that we're going to be covering up with some liquid latex. So I learned this method from the Sideshow Toys video of that gentleman painting up the Superman premium format head, and he covers the eyes with liquid latex. I don't know if he did anywhere else, but it was on, actually I think it was a Batman Begins head sculpt. So I'm just going to be using a burnt brown red from Ammo for the base color on Al Simmons's head. Now keep in mind, we do have the eyes covered up with liquid latex as well as the teeth. Now this is a perfect blank canvas starting point, but for the build-up, I've got a red leather also from Ammo and also a burnt sand. And this is gonna be a dry brushing method to really hone in on those burns and really make him extra crispy, or as the clown says, bad crispy, clown not like. So again, it was just building up with those 2 layers, and the lighter shade was the final layer for the dry brushing, and it just brings it all together and just makes those details absolutely pop. Now, I have noticed on the makeup there are certain red parts, like raw parts of the skin. I'm just going to be using a red oil color and just very lightly go in and shade certain parts, like the deep crevices where there'd be much more raw skin, I guess you could say. The makeup does change a lot throughout the actual film, and there are some interpretations where you see prototypes, early prototypes of the makeup where it looks vastly different. Now I'm just going to grab a black Liquitex ink, and this is going to be the base color for his actual suit. I did have to do 2 layers because the primer was bleeding through in some parts where it was a little bit more thin than, say, other parts of the actual suit, but it actually kind of worked. I did like the look, but it was obviously inconsistent, and I just needed it all a stark black. So I'm just going to grab a full body red acrylic just for the inside of his obliques, just where the chest insignia is. I don't know what you'd call those white things on his chest. I just call them like his chest emblems. Now I'm just going to grab a gray oil color and dry brush that over the black sections, because from what I've seen on the screen used suit, there is sort of like an off gray dry brushing going on. Just the it just gives texture to the suit. Now I'm just going to grab an ivory black and go in and weather the red portions and also the chest emblems as well, because the red is actually quite dark in the film, and also shading in under the pec and the oblique there. Now for the skulls, it's just good old-fashioned rub and buff, and I do seal this up with a Liquitex matte sealer for that matter, and I love dry brushing. Dry brushing is just the best thing in the world. Again, like the plaster and the silicone, it's so therapeutic. Now I'm just going to grab that red oil color again and go in around the collar and the spikes, because there is sort of a red shade going on right there. Especially, like, good reference is the McFarlane toys from the actual film. They're great reference to see how the suit looks, and obviously the screen view suit as well. So I'm just going to peel off the liquid latex, and again, this was so satisfying to do and just saves you a heap of time if you have to go back in and repaint the whites, where in this case it's an off gray. You got to keep in mind that our eyes are not pure white. So what I'm actually doing is using printed out on specially thin paper. I printed out the eyes. I've cut them just because he's obviously got a bit of a glare going on, and I did a mixture of PVA glue and a Liquitex gloss
and that kind of soaked into the paper, and that way it forms around the actual ball of the eye. And then once that was dry, I went back in with more Liquitex gloss and sealed them up, and then mounted him on a nice matte black MDF board, and we're good for the final reveal. And there we have it, guys. My half-scale Michael Jai White Spawn 1997 display bust is done and dusted. I'm actually really chuffed with how this has turned out. For the longest time, I've wanted a bust of Michael Jai White as Spawn. Again, just going back to the intro to the video, I think the casting for him as Spawn was just absolutely perfect. The film is severely underrated. Over time, I will eventually get to doing a full-scale version of this, but given how big of a dude Michael Jai White is, full scale is going to be a big print, so we're going to have to do that in separate pieces. But also just very happy with what I've got here. It's a nice tabletop piece, a nice shelf piece to add to the collection. So much so, I'm actually offering these on my Etsy store, and I will leave the link down below. Probably going to do a run of about 30, and they do come signed and numbered and on this matte black MDF board. And also just a massive shout out to my dear friend Karush, who was in our Uncharted short film, for him and his brother for hooking me up with this old school 1997 McFarlane toy burnt Spawn figure. It's just so cool. I remember trying to find these when I was a kid, and they're always sold out from Toys R Us, and I just end up crying. It was last week. So yeah, guys, I will leave the link down below if you are interested in purchasing this piece, but I had an absolute ball molding, casting, especially painting him. I love painting pieces like this where it's like a lot of organic pieces, the burns and stuff like that. It just really is fun. It's just simple in the execution, just a nice museum display. With that being said, wherever you are in the world, please have yourselves an absolute cracker of a day. I hope you will. Hope you're happy. Be merry, be silly. And until next time, Geeks and Geekettes, please always remember, cosplayers do it best.